Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 122 of the Monday Night Review. How are you all doing? It's getting a little bit hectic. I wanted to do a shout out to parents. I know that it's important to make the festive time nice for kids, but I don't know about you. I spend a lot of time in school, visiting school, planning nativities, ordering and making costumes, and I'm feeling frazzled already, and there's another 2 weeks of term. Something that really cheered me up this week was someone I follow on my personal Instagram sent me a really beautiful piece of jewellery. Makes you think how lovely some people on the internet are. Not all people, some people. And so I want to do a huge thank you to everyone who listens, even the silent lurkers who I now hear from. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who emails and sends messages and likes and follows and joins the Patreon. It's just really appreciated. And I was talking to someone about podcasts a couple of days ago, and they were like, oh, so how did you get into doing kind of true crime history podcast? And I said, basically, I spend all my time reading these books and researching stuff on the internet, and it gives me an outlet, and I'm very lucky that people listen, because otherwise it would just be me reading and Googling weird stuff with nowhere for it to go except for when we're at parties and someone says, what are you into? Or what are you reading? And then it all comes out in a weird way. So thank you very much for being the ears that receive my research. I was just having a look and thinking, is there a number of tabs on your phone that's acceptable? I'm up to 188. Most of them, I'd say at least 50% are cases that I want to cover or stuff that I've been researching. If something terrible happens to me and they look at my phone history, it's not going to do me any favours. Also, my kids are obsessed with Halloween, as you probably know. They are very upset if anyone puts Christmas decorations up before December, which they get from me. If that's a genetic thing, it's definitely coming straight from me. November is autumn and not Christmas. And so they were very cross with our lovely neighbour for having her Christmas lights and things up in November. And then, boom, December hits, and this year it's really, I don't know whether it's this seeing the decorations. A lot of people seem to be going early this year. And I did say to them, those people may have had a rubbish 2023 and they just need some joy in their lives. So who are we to deny them some Christmas joy for the whole of December? But boom, they've gone. This weekend I watched Home Alone 1 and 2, which are definitely Christmas movies. And there was mention of Scrooge at one point. So they seem to be going in hard this year. Usually they don't ramp up until kind of mid-December, but they were straight in there. We are off to Victorian England. It's very comforting in Victorian England, isn't it? Queen Victoria actually ascended to the throne in 1837 at the age of 18, and her reign saw a great deal of change in the penal system. For the first 31 years, executions were very public and enjoyed by the masses. If you think about literacy, low literacy, books were not as readily available as they were now. Obviously, no internet, no phones. It was an excuse for a get-together. It was a bit of drama. It was basically like a small festival. People would come from far and wide to witness the spectacle. In some cases, special trains were laid on. There was entertainment for the crowds. You could get food, you could get booze. And it was kind of like a party, a very grim party. These executions gained a lot of attention from the press, obviously, particularly when the criminal was female, like our criminal today. And yeah, it's a very interesting way to see how the press worked. The press now is faulty, but that's no new thing, as we'll find out later. 30 women and 2 teenage girls were to be executed in England and Scotland between May 1838 to the abolition of public hanging in May 1868. No, not the abolition of hanging in this country, but the abolition of public hanging. After 1868, hangings took place within the grounds of the prison. If these 21 had been convicted of poisoning, that's 2/3 of the total. Attempted murder ceased to be a capital crime in 1861 under the provisions of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act of that year. A total of 22 women were hanged in the decade of 1843 to the end of 1852, of whom 17 had been convicted of murder by poisoning, representing 77% of the total. There were no female executions from 1840 to 1842 in England, and there are none in Wales. Wales, good to their female prisoners, as they were good to their witches, I believe. The rash of poisonings led to a bill being introduced whereby only adult males could purchase arsenic, which, although is sexist, and we know I'm very much against sexism, but it does seem fair in this case. Arsenic was becoming known as either the inheritor's powder, and later on it was called the Victorian housewife's friend. Something that makes arsenic really appealing is it is one of the poisons that mimics natural illness, so vomiting, stomach cramps and diarrhea, but also it is cumulative, so you'd be a wally really to give someone a full whack of arsenic when you could just give them small amounts over a period of time that would eventually build up in their system and kill them, which was another appealing trait of it. Poisoning was considered a particularly evil crime, as it was completely premeditated, obviously, and it was very rare for a poisoner to be reprieved. But it was not unusual for females to be reprieved for other types of murder, including infanticide, which we'll come into later, unfortunately. I think it's a very Victorian trait, isn't it, that women would often be spared execution just on the basis of being women, even though, as I've just said, poisoners were rarely reprieved. But women couldn't possibly be executed. But when they were, up until 1868, it was done in public in this sort of really just shocking way to look back on it now. And quite often the crowds were sort of rowdy and drunk, and it must have just added a really terrifying edge to what was already a horrific experience. So we're going to Bedfordshire in the early 1800s. It's largely rural, with farming a major part of most people's lives. Society was, of course, hierarchical, with a clear class distinction between the land-owning gentry, farmers, and the rural working class. Education was not compulsory, and access to schooling was often limited, particularly for the working class, particularly for women. As you can imagine, for women at the time, few were educated to any noticeable degree, and the main hope was that they would marry someone kind and with enough money for them to live comfortably and for them to have a family. Poverty was a big deal, but it doesn't play a huge role in the story today that we hear of from anyone involved. So into this 1800s Bedfordshire, in 1819, Sarah Reynolds is born. She's the daughter of the town barber, Philip Reynolds, and his wife, Anne Reynolds, and they live in Potton in Bedfordshire. When she was 7, her father died, and her mother would go on to have a number of boyfriends, and this was obviously disapproved of by society, and it's not ideal for Sarah to have sort of this different numbers of men coming in and out of her life. There's no stable father figure. But, also there's lots of disparaging things about Anne Reynolds and about her promiscuity, but also perhaps, she's married her husband dies. She has children. She has to provide for them. So whether it's sort of a hunt for another husband that is constantly disappointed and leads to this reputation for promiscuity, we don't know. Sarah is very striking looking. She's tall, big brown eyes and long auburn hair. And when she's 19, she marries Simeon Mead. He has a daughter from a previous marriage called Anne, and they live in Potton for 2 years before moving to Tadlow, just over the border in Cambridgeshire in 1840. And I believe that he's a couple of years older, if that. Some versions have the reason for their move being that Sarah's beauty brought along a string of admirers which she didn't perhaps do much to discourage. In fact, a lot of versions have that she was promiscuous as her mother. But again, is this down to social feeling at the time? Whatever the reason, they moved to Tadlow in Cambridgeshire in 1840, and shortly after the move, she gives birth to their son, Jonah. But he sadly becomes ill and dies at only 7 months old, and in October 1840, Simeon Mead dies unexpectedly as well, and he's aged about 24. So for a little bit, Sarah plays the bereaved, grieving wife and mother. But soon after the death of her first husband, in fact, just 4 months later, Sarah marries her second husband, 23-year-old farm labourer William Dasley, in 1841, and they moved to the village of Wrestlingworth, which I believe is where he's from. Once again, she gains a number of admirers, and she also invites teenage Anne Mead, Simeon Mead's daughter, her stepdaughter, to live with her and her new husband. Now, William Dasley apparently wasn't keen on his stepdaughter living with them. Obviously, it's another mouth to feed. But it's perhaps more likely that he didn't like his wife sleeping with other men, as the rumours around the town and in accounts of her life have as happening. Again, whether she was a beautiful woman who gained admirers and people then believed that she was promiscuous, or whether she was actually promiscuous, I don't know. I wouldn't like to judge. She can do what she likes. For whatever reason, Dasley became a heavy drinker, and after one particularly heated argument, he beat his wife. She went on to tell a friend, or boyfriend, depending who you listen to, William Waldock, that she would, quote, do for any man who ever hit her. Unfortunately for Dasley, within the next couple of weeks, he grew ill. He had vomiting and stomach cramps, and his wife and her stepdaughter began to take care of him. When he didn't get better, the local doctor, Dr. Sandal, gave Dasley some medication, and he started to improve. Now, there are two different accounts of what happened next. They're probably both slightly true, but it's confusing. One has it that Sarah often went to the doctor herself to pick up her husband's prescription, and a neighbour would later say that she saw Sarah remove the pills and replace them with some others. When the neighbour questioned Sarah, she told her that she didn't trust the doctors and was going to a local village healer, but she knew that her husband wouldn't approve, so she was therefore using the doctor's bag or prescription to get them past him. Another version has Sarah making pills herself, which her stepdaughter saw her do and thought nothing of it, assuming that Sarah was breaking up the original pills and adding sugar to them to sweeten them, which was obviously a thing. William, however, started to refuse to take the pills made by his wife, and he was having a moan about it, and Anne Mead was saying, you're being a wally, and she took one herself to show him that there was nothing wrong with the pills. Sarah finds this out, starts telling her off, and Anne then becomes violently ill with similar symptoms to William: vomiting, stomach cramps. But for whatever reason, whether he was forced to, he must have been forced to. William eventually decided to take his wife's pills, and he dies on the 30th of October, 1842. Initially, William's death was not seen as suspicious and was put down to being an infection, but enough suspicious locals went to the coroner, and eventually the body of William Dasley was exhumed and found to contain traces of arsenic. After his death, suspicion rose against Sarah over the deaths of both her husbands, but also her son. So William Dasley's body is examined, found to contain traces of arsenic, and an arrest warrant is issued for Sarah, who's fled to London. And she's found after an extensive police search, but she's found by Superintendent Blunden of Biggleswade Police. And I appreciate the Englishness of that situation. She claimed to have no knowledge of poisons or how to get them, and was taken to jail in Bedford on the 24th of March, 1843 to await her court hearing. So remember, at this time, you would go to your local court and they would then find you guilty or not guilty, and then you had to wait for the quarterly local assizes. So since the news of William Dasley's arsenic poisoning had caused suspicion around the deaths of Jonah and Simeon Mead, their bodies were also exhumed. Traces of arsenic were found in Jonah, but Simeon's body was too decomposed to test. Meanwhile, Sarah came up with lots of reasons why she was not guilty, such as William poisoned himself, or he poisoned Jonah and Simeon, so she poisoned William as revenge for murdering her family. Obviously, none of this is very believable. On the 22nd of July, 1843, Sarah Dasley was tried for the murder of William Dasley at the Bedfordshire Summer Assizes. At the time, she was not tried for the murder of her son Jonah, and this was kept back. They still do this in some cases, so that if she was found not guilty, they could try her again separately for infanticide. Now, interestingly, although if she was found guilty of poisoning adults, she is unlikely to get off the death penalty, but as we heard earlier, she's more likely to get off for infanticide. The chemists who she bought arsenic from were able to testify against her, so that doesn't make her story of not knowing anything about how to get poisons helpful. Anne Mead and the neighbour Mrs. Carver, who'd seen her throwing away the pills and replacing them, also testified. William Waldock testified against Sarah, recounting the conversation where she said she'd kill any man that hit her. And obviously we know that William Dasley had beaten her, that Anne Mead was able to testify to that. The new Marsh test, first used to convict in France in 1840, was used to detect arsenic in William Dasley's body, and the result was used as forensic evidence in court against Sarah. And I believe, could be wrong, that this was the first time that the Marsh test was used as evidence in court in Britain. It only took 30 minutes for the jury to convict Sarah for the murder of her second husband. Judge Baron Alderson sentenced Sarah Dasley to death by hanging. She was executed on Saturday the 5th of August 1843. So that's really quick. The assizes were 22nd of July and 5th of August. So not only, the thing I think that's so shocking about executions at this time is the speed with which they took place. You're convicted and within weeks your execution is carried out. She was executed on Saturday the 5th of August 1843 and was the only woman ever to be publicly hanged at Bedford Jail. A crowd variously estimated at between 7,000 to 12,000 assembled in St. Loy's Street outside Bedford Jail to watch the hanging of the Potton Poisoner, as she'd become known in the press. It's believed that somewhere among that was William Waldock, whose evidence had obviously helped her conviction. The new drop gallows were erected on the flat roof over the main gate of the prison in the early hours of Saturday morning. I always find that deeply sinister, that for the majority of prisoners, the soundtrack to their last morning would probably be the sound of the gallows that they would be executed on being erected. The gatehouse was protected by a troop of javelin men, which I'm guessing is in case anyone tried to save her or the crowd got too rowdy. William Calcraft had arrived from London the previous day to perform the execution. Sarah was taken from the condemned cell to the prison chapel at around 10 o'clock for the sacrament. The under-sheriff of the county demanded her body from the governor, which I think is an official thing. And she's then taken to the press room for her arms to be pinioned, so her arms to be tied. She was then led up to the gatehouse roof and mounted the gallows platform. She's accompanied by the prison governor and the chaplain. She's asked if she wished to make any last statement, and she declines, merely asking Calcraft to be quick and repeating, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." He then pinions her legs, draws down the white hood over her head, adjusts the simple noose around her neck. He then descends the scaffold, withdraws the bolt supporting the trapdoors, and that's that. Her body was taken and buried in an unmarked grave. If you think modern press is terrible for its lies, there were broadsheets being sold and circulated during the hanging, telling of Sarah's confession with her last dying words, despite everyone there knowing that she did no such thing. And it's noted that the crowd were silent for the last bits for her execution, and then once she was hanging, lewd comments started to fly. And I think it's the thing. Humans have this terrible mob mentality, and for a lot of people who are executed, the last thing, there was just this angry mob basically making horrible remarks. It must just be absolutely, it's a very barbaric thing in our history, I believe. So Sarah's was the first execution at Bedford Jail since 1833, and as I said, she's the only woman to be publicly hanged there. In fact, there are only two more public hangings in the jail. Joseph Castle on the 31st of March 1860 for the murder of his wife, and William Worsley on the 31st of March 1868 for the murder of William Bradbury. It seems that for Sarah Dasley, the Potton Poisoner, her reason seems to be wanting to dispose of one man to be with another, and wanting to dispose of her child so that it didn't hinder her union with another man. Quite often men would not want to bring up the child of another man, especially during this time where William Dasley was a farm labourer. He's not going to be earning an awful lot. So bringing up another man's child is an expense he may not have been up for. And who knows? Maybe she would just have gone on and on. It doesn't seem to be for a big inheritance. As I said at the beginning, she wasn't living in poverty. She obviously wasn't earning a lot. And she wasn't marrying very rich men and then bumping them off. It literally just seems to be a kind of cold desire to get rid of people when she no longer wants them in her life. And that is the story of Sarah Dasley, the Potton Poisoner. I hope you are all really well. A lot of us have had this cold cough situation, which has not been fun. And last week, as you may have seen if you follow me on social media, I had laryngitis and I could not speak. My husband and family had a blissful 3 days where bossing was to a minimum because I just couldn't be heard over the din of my house. I always think it's really funny. I do tend to get laryngitis once a year. I will lose my voice completely. And I was saying to a friend who also gets it, by the time you lose your voice, you're feeling a lot better. And because you're losing your voice, everyone treats you really well because they're like, oh, you must be really ill because you've lost your voice. And you think, no, 3 days ago I felt really bad, but now I'm fine. And luckily I felt really rough, but we went to Harry Potter Studios for my son's 11th birthday. And although I felt rough, I think he felt fairly rough. We had the best day, and it would have been rubbish to have no voice and be trying to locate my children in Harry Potter Studios. So I'm sure that didn't help. Big shout out to my friend's son who said, did you lose your voice from shouting at your kids? And I said, no. And he said, that's a surprise. And I said, am I the shoutiest mum you know? And he went, yes, without even thinking about it. So that sums up my parenting style. I'd love to be one of those mums that never shouts. But I think of myself more as a sort of army major, having to shout out orders. You can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review. You can email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. I love to receive your emails, even if what's your favourite episode? What would you like to have more of? Just love to hear from you. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.